The frost hangs heavy over the Ardennes forest. December 16, 1944. Dawn has not yet broken. In the pre-dawn darkness, German panzer commanders peer through their vision slits, watching columns of American armor emerge from the morning mist like iron ghosts. The sound comes first, a mechanical rumble that vibrates through frozen earth. Then the silhouettes. Dozens of them. Sherman tanks, squat and angular, their 75mm guns sweeping the tree. One Wehrmacht officer, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, whispers into his radio, "They are everywhere. Gott im Himmel, they are everywhere." The confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht across Poland, France, and deep into Russia begins to crack like ice beneath a heavy boot. For years, German tank commanders had been told a comforting narrative. The American Sherman was inferior, a mechanical compromise born of mass production rather than engineering excellence. Intelligence reports circulated through Wehrmacht briefings described it as underarmored, undergunned, a quantity-over-quality solution typical of American industrial thinking. The Panther and Tiger tanks were supposed to be apex predators on the battlefield, each one worth 5 or 6 of the American machines. This mathematics of superiority had been drilled into every Panzer crew from Normandy to the Eastern Front. The Sherman, they were assured, was a target, not a threat. But mathematics on paper dissolves quickly when confronted with the reality of steel and fire. The German armored doctrine had been forged in the crucibles of Blitzkrieg, lightning war predicated on superior firepower, thicker armor, and the psychological dominance of the Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun and the Tiger's fearsome 88mm cannon. Each German tank was a craftsman's product, assembled with precision, engineered for individual superiority. Production numbers were secondary to battlefield dominance. A single Tiger I could, in theory, destroy multiple enemy tanks before being disabled. This thinking had served Germany well in the early war years, when their opponents fielded obsolete designs and poorly coordinated armor tactics. The Sherman, introduced in 1942, had been dismissed as another manifestation of American naivete, a democracy's tank, built by civilians who didn't understand real war. What German commanders discovered in the forests of Belgium, the hedgerows of Normandy, and later across the Rhine, was that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of mechanized warfare in 1944. The Sherman arrived not in ones or twos, but in biblical swarms. For every Panther that rolled off German production lines, carefully assembled, each component inspected, America produced dozens of Shermans. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone could manufacture more medium tanks in a month than Germany produced Panthers in an entire year. Ford's facility at River Rouge converted automobile production to tank production with such efficiency that Shermans rolled off assembly lines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sound that German commanders heard approaching through the Ardennes wasn't the roar of individual tanks. It was the mechanical thunder of an industrial civilization fully mobilized for war. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his journal after the Normandy campaign, "We destroyed 5 Shermans this morning before breakfast. By lunch, 10 more had taken their positions. By evening, we faced 20. Where do they come from? It is as if we are fighting not an army, but a factory." This observation, repeated in countless after-action reports and private correspondence, represented a psychological shift more devastating than any battlefield defeat. German tank doctrine assumed attrition would favor the side with superior individual weapons. But the Americans had inverted the equation. They accepted losses. Indeed, they had calculated them into their strategic planning. The Sherman wasn't designed to survive individual duels with Panthers or Tigers. It was designed to be everywhere, overwhelming German armor through sheer operational presence. The tank itself embodied American industrial philosophy. Its Christie suspension system, adapted from a 1930s civilian designer, provided remarkable mobility across terrain that would bog down heavier German tanks. Its radial aircraft engine, initially the Continental R-975, later supplemented by diesel variants, was reliable, maintainable, and could be serviced by mechanics with minimal specialized training. The Sherman's armor, though thinner than German equivalents, was sloped intelligently, increasing effective thickness without adding prohibitive weight. Most crucially, it could be shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded at French ports, and driven hundreds of miles to the front lines with minimal mechanical failure. German tanks, by contrast, required specialized rail transport and frequently broke down during road marches. But the Sherman's true advantage emerged not from its technical specifications, but from the ecosystem that surrounded it. Every Sherman that crossed into Europe came with a logistics tale that German commanders found incomprehensible. Replacement engines arrived within days. Damaged transmissions were swapped in field workshops that operated with assembly line efficiency. American tank crews destroyed in combat were replaced by trained reserves who had practiced on identical equipment stateside. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, struggled to maintain their armored forces with spare parts cannibalized from disabled vehicles. A Panther with a damaged transmission might sit immobile for weeks waiting for replacement components. A Tiger with a broken track link could become a permanent fortification for lack of the specialized tools needed for repair. The psychological impact of this material disparity manifested in combat doctrine. German tank commanders, aware that each Panther or Tiger represented an irreplaceable asset, became increasingly cautious. They sought ideal ambush positions, waited for flanking shots, withdrew when faced with overwhelming numbers. The Sherman crews, by contrast, developed an aggressive confidence born from knowing that losses would be replaced. They advanced in coordinated groups, one tank suppressing German positions while others maneuvered for killing shots. They called in artillery and air support with radios that worked reliably, coordinating combined arms operations that isolated German armor from supporting infantry. The Germans had created individual masterpieces. The Americans had created a system. Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, observing Sherman operations in Italy, noted, "The German tanks are magnificent machines. Ours are adequate machines in magnificent numbers." This distinction between magnificence in engineering and magnificence in scale represented a philosophical divide between industrial civilizations. Germany had entered World War II with a 19th-century conception of warfare updated with 20th-century technology. They believed superior craftsmanship and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. America brought an entirely different vision: warfare as an industrial process, where victory belonged not to the army with the best individual weapons, but to the nation that could sustain production, maintain supply lines, and replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The Sherman became the physical manifestation of this philosophy. Its very ordinariness, its lack of dramatic engineering features, its mechanical simplicity, made it revolutionary. German tank crews expected to face worthy opponents, machines that would test their skills and training. Instead, they faced an endless conveyor belt of adequate armor that simply refused to stop coming. After the Battle of Ardennes in September 1944, where American Sherman forces destroyed nearly 300 German tanks while losing fewer than 40 of their own, Panzer General Hermann Bulge wrote bitterly, "We are not losing to American tanks. We are losing to American factories." The sound of the Sherman engine became, for German soldiers, what the Stuka siren had been for their enemies in 1940, a herald of inevitable defeat. That distinctive mechanical growl, multiplied by dozens of engines, announced not just approaching armor, but the presence of an industrial system that could not be defeated through battlefield excellence alone. Wehrmacht intelligence officers compiled increasingly desperate reports about American production capacity. One document from late 1944 estimated that America could replace its entire armored force 3 times over in the time it would take Germany to reconstitute its Panzer divisions once. The numbers were so disproportionate that many German commanders simply refused to believe them. How could a democratic society, supposedly weakened by political debate and individual liberty, mobilize such overwhelming material power? This cognitive dissonance between Nazi ideology that proclaimed democracies weak and decadent and the battlefield reality of American material abundance created a psychological crisis in the Wehrmacht officer corps. They had been taught that National Socialist discipline and racial superiority would overcome any disadvantage. The Sherman, more than any other weapon system, exposed this ideology as fantasy. The tank was designed by democratic engineers, built by union workers, crewed by civilians in uniform who rotated home after their service. It represented everything Nazi doctrine claimed was weak about liberal societies: compromise, mass production, adequate rather than excellent solutions. Yet it worked. It kept coming. It won. German commanders began documenting this realization in private correspondence that revealed a profound disillusionment. Major General F.W. von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for Army Group G, wrote after the war, "We feared their air power, we respected their artillery, but we were psychologically unprepared for their armor. Not because the individual tank was formidable, but because the quantity seemed infinite. You could fight brilliantly, destroy 10 of their tanks, and 20 more would appear. It was like fighting an ocean with a bucket." This metaphor, the ocean versus the bucket, appeared repeatedly in German accounts. The Sherman had become, in their minds, liquid armor, flowing around strong points, flooding defensive positions, drowning German resistance through sheer volume. The battle reports tell the story in cold statistics. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, even the most optimistic commanders understood they were fighting against time and tonnage rather than enemy skill. The Ardennes offensive, designed to split Allied forces and capture American fuel depots, was premised on a desperate calculation. Strike before American industrial might could fully mobilize, seize enemy supplies because German logistics could not sustain extended operations, achieve victory through surprise because methodical warfare now favored the Allies. The offensive failed not primarily due to tactical mistakes, but because German planning could not account for American material resilience. When Panzer columns broke through initial defenses, they encountered not panic but reorganization. Sherman tanks destroyed in the first days of fighting were replaced within a week. American infantry divisions, temporarily scattered, reformed around armor strongpoints and counterattacked. The fuel depots that German forces desperately needed to capture were either evacuated or defended by improvised battle groups that appeared with impossible speed. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that could absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger within days. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, perhaps Germany's most innovative armored warfare theorist, reflected after the war, "We created the doctrine of mobile warfare. We perfected it in Poland and France. But the Americans industrialized it. They took our innovation and made it a product they could manufacture at scale. This was our defeat, not on the battlefield, but in the factory." This acknowledgement, from a man who had commanded panzer armies across Europe, represented the final dissolution of German military confidence. The Sherman had not defeated German armor through superior engineering. It had defeated the entire concept of warfare that Nazi Germany had built its military around. The symbolic resonance of the Sherman extended beyond its immediate military role. For German soldiers who had been promised victory through racial superiority and ideological purity, the tank represented the triumph of democratic values translated into steel. It was built by a multi-ethnic workforce, African Americans, women, immigrants, in factories governed by union contracts and labor laws. Its design emerged from competitive bidding and civilian engineering committees rather than authoritarian decree. It embodied compromise. Not the best armor, not the most powerful gun, not the fastest speed, but an optimal balance of capabilities that could be produced in overwhelming numbers. This was perhaps the most devastating aspect of German commanders' confrontation with the Sherman. They were not being defeated by a wonder weapon or revolutionary technology. They were being defeated by adequate equipment, competently employed, produced in quantities that reflected the complete mobilization of an industrial democracy. The Sherman was a democratic tank in every sense. Accessible, maintainable, replaceable, and backed by a system of production and logistics that treated each vehicle as one component of a larger mechanism rather than an irreplaceable masterwork. The panic that German commanders experienced was not the immediate terror of combat, but the slow, grinding realization that they were fighting an unwinnable war. Each encounter with American armor reinforced this understanding. The Shermans kept coming. They came through the bocage of Normandy, across the fields of France, over the Rhine bridges, into the heart of Germany itself. They came with fuel trucks and ammunition carriers, with recovery vehicles and mobile workshops, with replacement crews and fresh supplies. They came as the physical manifestation of a system that could not be defeated through battlefield excellence because it existed on a scale that transcended individual battles. In the final months of the war, as Allied armor pushed toward Berlin, German commanders stopped writing about tactical superiority. Their reports became stark accountings of material disparity. One Panzer Brigade commander, surrounded in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, radioed his final message: "We are out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of hope. The Americans have everything. We fought well. It wasn't enough." This epitaph could serve for the entire Wehrmacht armored force. They fought with skill and courage. They operated superior individual weapons, and none of it mattered against an enemy who could replace every loss and sustain operations indefinitely. The Sherman tank, that squat, practical machine that German intelligence had once dismissed as inferior, had become the symbol of their defeat. Not through any single dramatic victory, but through relentless, mechanical persistence. It represented a form of warfare that industrial civilization had made inevitable. Conflict decided not by the brilliance of commanders or the courage of soldiers, but by production capacity, supply chains, and the ability to sustain operations across continents and oceans. The Americans had not just won battles with the Sherman. They had redefined what victory meant in modern warfare. And so the metallic rumble that echoed through the Ardennes that December morning in 1944 carried with it the sound of history turning, of old certainties dissolving, of a world where ideological conviction and tactical excellence proved insufficient against the organized power of an industrial democracy fully mobilized for war. The German commanders who heard that sound understood, in that moment, that they were facing not just enemy armor but the future itself. A future where wars would be won not by warriors, but by factories, not by individual heroism, but by systematic production, not by brilliant tactics, but by overwhelming material presence. The Sherman had become more than a tank. It had become the iron verdict of history, passing judgment on an empire that had believed superiority could be proclaimed rather than produced, and finding that belief wanting in the most fundamental way possible. The frost still hung heavy over the Ardennes, but the dawn that broke revealed a world transformed, where the old equations of warfare had been rewritten in American steel.